You are listening to James Cameron's Spider-Man, written by Tim Maxwell, based on a scriptment by James Cameron. Prologue, From Up Here, by Peter Parker.
Welcome to one of my favorite night spots. The service is slow, but the thing I like about it, it's not usually too crowded. Empire State Building was lower than me, so there was only one place I could be, 14,000 feet above the street, on the radio mast of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Below, the traffic moved like tiny lights through the city's circulatory system. It all looks so civilized from up here. Like there's some kind of logic to it all. It's all so clear, but you get down there on the street and nothing's clear. Down on the street, humanity moved in all its variegated glory. Cabs, cops, people bustling about. From stockbrokers to hookers, priests to junkies. At a corner newsstand, a stack of Newsweek magazines caught my eye. The cover featured a grainy, long lens, black and white shot of a guy in tights, apparently crawling up the side of a building, with the headline, "The Spider-Man, Hero or Vigilante?" I dropped down from the roof of the newsstand, a red spandex-clad arm slapping $2 on the counter as I grabbed a Newsweek. The news guy whirled around as I disappeared, looking up and all around with no sign of me. Grinning, he raised his fist in the air. Back atop the WTC, still hanging, I pulled the Newsweek out of my belt and stared at the cover in the moonlight. How can I expect them to get it? I don't even get it. I do wish they'd at least get my name right. It's Spider-Man, not the Spider-Man. Jeez, boneheads. I need a better publicist. I read the magazine easily in half, then quarters, then eighths. Why not? It's easy for me. Releasing the shreds, I watched them flutter down over the city like confetti. Wouldn't they have kittens if they knew Spider-Man wasn't even a man, just a kid named Peter Parker?
Chapter 1, Pent-Up Adolescence. Peter! The shrill call of his name cut through the quiet morning like a familiar alarm. An elderly woman, her voice strong despite her frail appearance, stood at the foot of the stairs. "Peter, you're going to be late," she yelled again, her voice full of both exasperation and affection. Upstairs, Peter Parker, 17 years old, stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He leaned in, carefully inspecting a small zit on his forehead, as if it were the most pressing concern in the world. With a grimace, he popped it, wincing as if the small blemish embodied all the annoyances of teenage life. Satisfied, he adjusted his glasses and examined his reflection once more. Same scrawny frame, same unruly brown hair, same oversized glasses that made him look perpetually nerdy. He shrugged. Screw it. It didn't matter what anyone thought. Grabbing a hefty stack of books, Peter swung the bathroom door open and headed downstairs, his sneakers squeaking faintly on the wooden floorboards. As he entered the kitchen, the smell of toast and bacon greeted him, though he barely had time to enjoy it. His Aunt May, ever thin and wiry, fussed over him like a mother hen, her gentle hands straightening his collar, her brow furrowed with unnecessary worry. Peter loved her, truly, but mornings like these made it hard to show it. His Uncle Ben sat at the table reading the paper, his weathered face hidden behind the headlines. They were old, too old to be parents to a teenager. But they'd stepped into the role when Peter was just a boy, after that awful day when a plane crash took his real parents away forever. It had been so sudden, so final. One morning, Peter had a family. The next, he didn't. Even now, at 17, there was a part of him that still blamed himself, as if his existence had somehow caused the accident. He knew rationally that wasn't true, but deep down, the guilt lingered. In his mind, he could still hear the frightened 6-year-old he used to be, begging them to come back, promising he wouldn't make any trouble if only they'd return. Moving from his home in Maryland to Aunt May and Uncle Ben's bungalow in suburban Flushing, New York, had been another blow. The neighborhood wasn't much, a cluster of small, cramped houses, all pushed together as if they, too, were mourning something. Peter's high school was a few miles away, in Forest Hills, where the homes were bigger, the lawns greener, and the kids wealthier. To his classmates, Peter wasn't just a nerd. He was the poor nerd, the one from the wrong side of the tracks. But Peter was smart, brilliant even. His love for science isolated him from the others, and he knew it. He didn't care, though. Let them listen to their music and pretend they were cool. One day, he told himself, he'd be the one making headlines, solving impossible problems, maybe even curing cancer. They could laugh now, but in the end, he'd win. At least, that's what he told himself. The truth was harder to admit. Underneath his bravado, Peter was shy, desperately lonely, and all too aware of the walls he had built around himself. He wore his isolation like a badge, a symbol of superiority, but it was a fragile shield. Whenever those feelings of emptiness crept up on him, he'd bury himself in his books, losing himself in knowledge. In science, there was order. In science, there was peace. But no matter how smart he was, Peter still knew little about the world outside his textbooks. His 17-year-old mind believed it understood everything: the injustices, the flaws, the broken systems. And yet, Peter didn't even understand himself. His intellect was a fortress, one that kept him from exploring the messier parts of life. Sports? Pointless. Just a bunch of muscle-headed jocks crashing into each other like rutting elk. Girls? They were intriguing in theory, but in practice, he hadn't the faintest idea how to talk to them. Dancing? He'd tried it once. Never again. He didn't need another reminder of how out of sync he felt with the world around him. So here he was, an awkward, pent-up adolescent with no outlet for his frustrations. He'd never even kissed a girl, let alone anything else. The idea seemed far off, as if that part of life belonged to someone else entirely. Yet, for all his insecurities, There was something in Peter, a quiet strength that even he didn't fully recognize. Beneath his awkwardness and his doubts, there was grit, a resilience that had never been tested. But it would be soon, very soon. That afternoon at school, Peter Parker sat with his usual group of friends in the lunchroom. They were a collection of straight-A misfits, quiet kids who kept their heads down and got their work done. Books, video games, and science projects were their safe zone, a world they could retreat into away from the noise of high school life. Peter was listening to his friends talk about some new video game, but his attention kept drifting elsewhere. Across the room, Mary Jane Watson. She sat at her usual table, laughing with her friends, her bright red hair catching the light every time she tossed it back. To Peter, she was magnetic. He had spent all year watching her from a distance, admiring everything about her, her confidence, her smile, the way she seemed to float effortlessly through the chaos of high school. She had no idea he existed, of course. Why would she? Mary Jane was popular, and Peter was, well, Peter. His last class of the day was biology, the one he looked forward to the most. Not just because he loved science, but because Mary Jane sat a few desks away. Today, however, the teacher's lesson on cellular reproduction barely registered. Peter's gaze kept drifting toward her as she scribbled notes, or occasionally whispered something to one of her friends. He wondered, as he often did, what it would be like to actually talk to her, to somehow break through the invisible wall that separated them. The teacher's voice snapped him out of his daydream. "All right, class," she said. "You'll need to pair up for your term projects. This will count for a big part of your grade, so choose wisely." Peter's heart sank. He knew the drill. No one would choose him willingly, and he'd end up partnered with whoever else was left over. He hunched over his notebook, hoping to avoid the awkward moments that always followed these announcements. The noise of students finding partners filled the room. "Peter?" The voice was soft, but it startled him. He looked up to find Mary Jane standing in front of his desk, her smile warm and a little hesitant. "Do you want to be my partner?" she asked. Peter blinked, momentarily stunned. Was this really happening? Mary Jane Watson, the Mary Jane, was asking him to be her partner? He could barely think straight, his mind scrambling to catch up. He'd been invisible to her all year, and now here she was, standing close enough for him to smell the faint sweetness of her perfume. Yeah, sure," Peter stammered, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "That'd be great." Behind her, Mary Jane's friends exchanged amused glances, and Peter felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew why she had chosen him. She needed an A in the class to keep her grades high enough to get the car her parents had promised her. And who better to help her get that A than Peter the nerd? But even with that knowledge hanging over him, he couldn't help feeling a thrill at being her partner. As they discussed the project, Peter's pulse raced. She was close, talking to him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For a moment, he let himself imagine what it would be like if they could talk like this outside of class, if they could be more than just partners on a school assignment. The idea of winning her over, of somehow being someone she noticed and cared about, made his heart beat faster. But he quickly pushed the thought aside. Mary Jane was dating Nathan Flash McCreary, after all, star athlete, gymnastic captain, and all-around golden boy. Flash was everything Peter wasn't: popular, athletic, wealthy. He drove a Porsche, for crying out loud, while Peter took the bus. Still, Peter couldn't stop the small flicker of hope that settled in his chest. It was stupid, he knew. Mary Jane was in a different league altogether. Her social circle, her life, Everything about her seemed so far removed from his own. But standing there, talking about science projects, it was hard not to imagine the impossible. The final bell rang, and Peter felt a pang of disappointment. He wanted to keep talking to her, but the day was over. As they walked out together into the parking lot, his heart raced. He was still beside her, still talking, and for a few fleeting minutes, it felt like the barrier between them was thinning. But then Flash's Porsche pulled up, gleaming under the afternoon sun. Flash, all casual arrogance, slid out of the car and shot Peter a quick, dismissive glance, before turning to Mary Jane with that easy grin of his. Peter felt a wave of discomfort as he stood there, knowing he didn't belong in this scene. "Hey, Peter," Mary Jane said, her voice kind, maybe even a little hesitant. "We're heading over to Flash's house. Want to come? We could play tennis or swim." Peter froze. The thought of standing next to Flash on a tennis court, his pale, skinny frame beside Flash's athletic build, was mortifying. There was no way he could compete with that. His confidence shriveled at the thought. I can't," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've got a seminar at the university. Honors thing." Mary Jane smiled, a little disappointed but understanding. "Okay, maybe next time?" Flash, leaning against his car, snickered. "Yeah, Parker. Maybe next time you can show us your tennis skills." His friends laughed, the mocking sound echoing in Peter's ears. Peter forced a smile, swallowing his embarrassment. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his head down, heart heavy. The flicker of hope that had ignited earlier in the day faded, replaced by the familiar feeling of invisibility. Chapter 2. Spider Encounter. Later that evening, Peter found himself at the seminar he had been eagerly anticipating for weeks. The university lab tour felt like a glimpse into the future he dreamed of, if he could just land a scholarship. This lab was known for pioneering research in recombinant DNA and gene therapy, fields that had captivated Peter since he first started reading about genetics. His eyes gleamed as the professor led them through the pristine corridors, showcasing state-of-the-art equipment. As the group reached a sealed glass door, the professor gestured toward the video monitors inside. Beyond the glass lay the restricted area, where the most advanced genetic experiments were taking place. On the screens, Peter could see small flasks containing fruit flies. "We're using synthesized transfer RNA to recode the genome of these flies," the professor explained, a touch of pride in his voice. "Transferring genetic information from one species to another." Peter leaned forward, fascinated by the possibilities. His mind raced with ideas as the professor continued to point out details on the monitors. "On the left, we have 10 mutagenically activated flies," the professor said, gesturing to the screen. "On the right, the control group." Peter squinted. "There's only 9 flies on the left," he noted. The professor paused, puzzled, counting the flies on the screen. As he did, Peter's gaze wandered, and he noticed something small and twitching in the corner of the room. Near an air duct, caught in a spider's web, was the missing fly. The spider, oblivious to the human drama unfolding nearby, crept closer to its trapped prey. Peter stared for a moment, intrigued by the tiny drama of predator and prey, then shifted his attention back to the professor, who had resumed his lecture. They moved on, but Peter stayed behind for a moment, asking if he could take a few pictures for his school paper. As the rest of the group disappeared around the corner, Peter pulled out his camera, framing the sleek lab in his viewfinder. He was absorbed in the shot, adjusting the focus, when a sudden, sharp sting shot through his hand. Instinctively, Peter looked down. A small black spider sat on the back of his hand, its fangs still embedded in his skin. With a quick flick of his wrist, he crushed it, smearing the tiny body against his palm. He rubbed the sting, feeling the lingering burn, but didn't think much of it. His mind was too focused on catching up with the group. Hours later, on the subway ride home, Peter felt the sting more acutely. His hand had begun to swell, a red patch spreading outward from the bite. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He pressed his fingers to his temples, suddenly lightheaded. His vision blurred, and the colors around him seemed to swirl and merge together in strange, abstract patterns. By the time Peter stumbled into the house, it felt like the world was slipping away from him. Aunt May called out, but he barely heard her. Everything was muffled, distant. He managed to mumble something about being tired before disappearing into his room. The moment he closed the door, Peter collapsed to the floor. He tried to pull himself toward the bed, but only managed a few feet before a violent tremor overtook him. His entire body convulsed, shaking uncontrollably. Darkness swallowed his vision, and then came the visions, nightmarish, hallucinatory images flashing in his mind. Webs, glistening, silken threads, spreading out in every direction. He felt as if he were crawling over them, weaving through an endless labyrinth of shimmering strands. Eyes stared at him from the shadows, cold, black, predatory. He felt the sharp lunge of a spider, the suffocating struggle of prey trapped and helpless. He tumbled deeper into the abyss, surrounded by the distorted sounds of creatures skittering across webs. And then a sudden sensation of leaping through the air, soaring over rooftops and dark alleyways. Peter woke with a start, gasping for air. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing him in its warmth. Relief washed over him. It had all been a dream, just a terrible dream. Or so he thought. When he blinked and looked around, his heart seized in his chest. He wasn't in his bed. He wasn't even in his house. He was 80 feet above the ground, perched on the metal frame of a high-tension tower, wearing nothing but his underwear. Below, the city moved on, cars and people oblivious to his precarious position. Panic surged through him. How had he gotten here? How could this be real? He clung to the tower, the metal cool against his skin, willing himself to stay calm. Slowly, carefully, he climbed down, his body trembling with the effort. By the time he reached the ground, Peter's embarrassment was matched only by his confusion. He slunk along the fence, desperately hoping no one had seen him. As he crept through the bushes, 2 girls from his class walked by, chatting casually, unaware of his presence. Peter ducked low, heat flushing his cheeks. What was happening to him? Eventually, Peter made it back to the house. Slipping inside, he avoided Aunt May and Uncle Ben, muttering something about being late for school before rushing to his room. There, he collapsed into the dark corner of the basement, shaking uncontrollably. He pulled his knees to his chest, trying to make sense of the dizziness, the strange sensations coursing through his body. It was then that his eyes caught movement. A tiny spider, descending slowly from the ceiling on a thin, silken thread. Peter stared, transfixed. The morning light illuminated the creature, giving it a golden glow. Its delicate legs moved with a hypnotic grace, each movement slow and precise. To Peter, it seemed almost otherworldly, like some kind of divine messenger. He watched, mesmerized, as it danced in the light. Hours later, after the sun had set, Peter slipped back into the house. His aunt and uncle called out to him, concerned, but Peter barely heard them. He mumbled an excuse about needing to study and retreated to his room. His mind was still reeling from the events of the day. In the bathroom, he stared at his reflection. His face looked pale, his hands steady now. The tremors had stopped, but his wrists ached. As he rubbed them absent-mindedly, Peter noticed something strange. His vision had cleared. He could see perfectly, without his glasses. With a rush of excitement, Peter grabbed his glasses and put them on, but the world blurred instantly. He ripped them off, blinking in surprise. Somehow, impossibly, his eyesight had been restored. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. He laughed softly to himself. The spider bite. It had done something to him, something incredible. Exhausted, Peter collapsed into bed, his mind spinning with the possibilities. That night, as he slept, the dreams returned. But this time, they were different. No longer chaotic and terrifying, the visions had taken on an eerie grace. He saw webs, intricate and perfect, woven in the blackness of space. He moved through them, not as prey, but as something else entirely. The next morning, Peter awoke slowly, his eyes fluttering open with caution. For a moment, he hesitated, half expecting some lingering nightmare to greet him. But as his vision sharpened, he found himself still in his bed, everything looking perfectly ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across his room. He exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. In fact, he felt surprisingly good. There was an unusual vitality coursing through him, an energy he hadn't felt in years, if ever. He threw back the covers with enthusiasm, only to be stopped short. Something clung to him, holding him in place. Peter frowned, tugging at the sheets. A sticky white substance had glued him to the bedding, some kind of silky material. His eyes widened in disbelief. The webbing covered him completely, binding him to the fabric. Panic surged through him, and he thrashed, struggling to free himself from the mess of sticky strands. Where had it come from? Then he saw his wrists. There, just beneath the surface of his skin, a pearly white fluid was slowly oozing from tiny, nearly invisible slits, about 1/4 of an inch long. Peter's breath hitched. He pressed on the skin next to one of the slits, curious and horrified at the same time. Suddenly, something dark, a thorn-like shape, emerged from beneath his skin. Before he could react, a jet of sticky white silk shot out, splattering onto his face. Peter screamed, his voice piercing the early morning quiet. "Peter, are you all right?" came Aunt May's voice from the other side of the door. Peter's heart raced. "Yes," he called back, frantically wiping the webbing from his face. "I'm fine, Aunt May. I was just, practicing for a school play." "Oh, that's wonderful," Aunt May replied, her voice warm with approval. "I'm so happy you're getting involved in other activities." Peter sat on the edge of the bed, still panting as his heart thudded in his chest. He pulled the remaining strands of silky webbing off himself, marveling at its strength. What was happening to him? He stared at his wrists in disbelief, watching the slits close up, the pearlescent fluid retreating beneath his skin. His breathing grew shallow as panic set in. His mind raced, grasping for any rational explanation, but none came. He felt like Gregor Samsa from Kafka's Metamorphosis, waking up to find he had become something other, some kind of bug. Desperate for air, for freedom from the terrifying transformation, Peter rushed out the back door. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to escape. Escape from whatever was happening to him, from this grotesque new reality. He ran without direction, feet pounding the pavement, heart thudding in his ears. His legs carried him faster than he had ever moved before, blurring past trees and houses in a blind frenzy. Before Peter even realized it, he had shot through a dense patch of trees and burst out onto a street, right into the path of a speeding delivery truck. Peter gasped and instinctively leaped into the air. The truck's horn blared as it roared past, inches from him. Peter's breath caught in his throat. He was no longer on the ground. He looked down, wide-eyed, to find himself hanging 20 feet above the street, palms stuck to the side of a smooth building. Panic turned to terror. "Oh, no," he muttered, glancing down at the solid earth far below. He clung to the wall like a cat stuck in a tree, legs dangling uselessly as he tried to make sense of what was happening. His palms held him fast, like some human suction cup, his feet hovering awkwardly above the ground. A kid pedaled by on his bike, glancing up at the scene. Peter yelled down at him, voice thick with desperation. "Hey, kid, call 911. The kid stared at him for a second, wide-eyed, before pedaling away as fast as he could, clearly freaked out. Peter cursed under his breath. He tried to peel one palm away from the wall, but his grip gave out completely. He tumbled through the air, arms flailing, and landed with a soft, almost graceful thud on his hands and feet. He blinked, disoriented. Somehow, he had landed perfectly, as if his body knew exactly what to do. Standing up slowly, Peter felt a surge of something powerful pulsing through his muscles. His body, now humming with energy, felt different, stronger, faster. His limbs buzzed with a new, strange strength that frightened and excited him in equal measure. He flexed his arms experimentally, feeling the tautness in his muscles, the undeniable rush of power beneath his skin. "What is happening to me?" he whispered to himself, testing his legs next, feeling the energy course through him like electricity. It didn't stop. His body was still changing. But where would it end? Chapter 3. Labyrinth of Web. After school, Peter found a hidden spot in the junkyard. The air was thick with rust and oil, but it didn't matter. This was where he could practice. Alone, away from prying eyes, he began testing the limits of his strange new powers. With a flick of his wrist, a stream of silk shot out. It was uneven at first, more like a wild, uncontrollable squirt than the smooth thread he had in mind. He tried again, adjusting the angle of his hand, but the silk sprayed across a stack of scrap metal, creating a sticky mess. Frustrated, Peter wiped his brow. It was like learning to write with a new hand, clumsy, awkward, but full of potential. He studied his wrists, noticing the small slits that produced the silk. "I just need control," he thought. He bent his hand backward, feeling the strange tension building in his arm. Another shot. This time the silk came out finer, thinner. It spiraled into the air before attaching to a rusted car door. He gave it a tug. Strong. Stronger than any thread he'd ever seen. Strong enough to lift him? Only one way to find out. With a deep breath, Peter wrapped the webbing around his hand and pulled. The silk held, and Peter's feet lifted off the ground. He hung there for a moment, suspended in midair, legs dangling. A grin spread across his face as he swung lightly back and forth, feeling the power coursing through his body. It wasn't long before he started experimenting. Peter tried different angles, different wrist movements. He learned to control the thickness of the webbing, adjusting the flow like a seasoned artist with a brush. He shot webs at cans tossed into the air, hitting them with increasing accuracy. At first, he missed more often than not, but with each attempt, his aim sharpened. Soon, the junkyard was transformed into a chaotic labyrinth of webs. Cars were cocooned in sticky threads, and scrap metal was draped in silken strands. Peter had turned the place into his own personal training ground, a testament to both his growing skill and his wild, unchecked energy. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, Peter was exhausted, but exhilarated. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that whatever strange fuel his body was burning, it demanded food. A lot of it. At home, he devoured everything in sight: sandwiches, milk, fruit, even leftovers from the night before. Aunt May, delighted by his sudden appetite, watched in amusement as he downed half a gallon of milk in one go. But Peter barely noticed her. His mind was elsewhere, still running through everything he had learned in the junkyard. That night, Peter sat at his desk, trying to focus on his homework. The open window allowed the cool night air to brush against his skin. He stared out into the darkness, feeling an odd pull toward it. What used to feel threatening, like an abyss of the unknown, now felt welcoming, inviting. Without a second thought, Peter climbed out through the window and leapt onto the roof. The world of night called to him, and he answered, running along the peaks of houses, leaping effortlessly from one roof to the next. The city lay beneath him, alive with the hum of cars and distant voices, but Peter was above it all. Free. The heights that once made his heart race with fear now only filled him with exhilaration. He climbed to the top of a streetlight, using a strand of webbing to lower himself gracefully to the ground. His movements were fluid, like a dancer performing in a silent, invisible symphony. When he landed, he bowed to the empty street, his grin wide and uncontainable. The fear, the confusion, everything that had overwhelmed him before, was fading. In its place was something else, something deeper. Peter felt powerful, alive in a way he had never known. He couldn't help but wonder how far he could push it, how far this transformation would take him. Late one evening, Peter sat quietly on the roof of Mary Jane's house, his heart racing. He had never been this close to her world, and it felt strange. Moving carefully, he climbed down the side of the house, sticking to the wall as only he could. He peeked through her window, trying to see what her life was like when she thought no one was watching. Through the glass, Peter saw Mary Jane turn off the lights, the room falling into shadows. She slipped into bed, her red hair resting softly against her pillow. Peter realized he shouldn't be there, spying like this. Feeling a little guilty, he quickly climbed back up, disappearing into the night before anyone noticed. But even this brief, forbidden glimpse was overwhelming. His grip on the wall faltered, and before he could recover, Peter lost control. With a crash, he tumbled into the rose bushes below. Panic surged through him as lights flickered on inside the house. He bounded into the shadows, heart racing, disappearing into the night as voices stirred behind him. The next morning, Peter was slumped over his desk, barely awake as his teacher's voice droned on in the background. His eyelids drooped, the exhaustion from the night's chaos pulling him into a half-conscious state. The sound of the bell startled him awake. As the rest of the class filed out, his teacher called him aside, concern etched on her face. "Peter, what's going on? Your grades are slipping," she said, her tone softer than usual. "You were one of my top students, but lately, you seem distracted." Peter shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to explain. It's just a personal thing," he muttered. "I'll be fine." But even as he spoke, he knew something was changing. His life was changing, and there was no going back. Later that day, Peter sat on the floor of his room with a piece of cardboard and a marker in hand, scribbling down ideas for what he might call himself. "Human spider," he wrote, staring at it for a moment. Nah. He turned the cardboard over and tried again. Man spider. Still no. He scratched his head, then paused. Spider-Man. He stared at the words for a beat longer, something clicking. Yeah, maybe. That weekend, Peter hit the boardwalk at Rockaway Beach, blending into the crowd. Dressed in all black, a fishnet stocking pulled over his head to hide his face, he began climbing streetlights, flipping and swinging with the newfound grace his powers had given him. A sign leaned against a nearby pole. Spider-Man. It read in bold marker strokes. People stopped to watch, tossing quarters and dollar bills into a dish by his feet. Between a mime and a street drummer banging on upside-down plastic pails, Peter staked out his turf, working the crowd with stunts that had them cheering. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The adrenaline coursed through him as he pushed his limits, performing for strangers. A man in the crowd approached him afterward, grinning. "Do you do private parties?" the man asked, glancing at Peter's makeshift costume. Peter shrugged, unsure. Sure, I guess." "I'll pay you $50, the man replied. "But you might want to get yourself a better costume." Back in school, Peter sat at his desk, doodling absent-mindedly in his math notebook. His mind was far from the equations on the board. Instead, he sketched rough designs for a suit, variations of costumes that could represent his new identity. One sketch after another, none of them quite right. When he got home, Peter set to work. He bought a tight, snappy lycra dance skin from a studio downtown, one half red, the other midnight blue. Using liquid thread, he drew haphazard web patterns across the suit's surface, adding a black spider on the chest and a large red one on the back. When he slipped into the suit for the first time, he stood in front of the mirror, turning to catch the light. Not bad, he thought. The mask came next. He cut the fishnet stocking to create eye holes, gluing black angular shapes over them to give the mask a menacing jack-o'-lantern look. It was crude, but it worked. The eyes were wide, wise, and a little wicked. They made him look like someone, or something, else entirely. Peter wasn't done. He fashioned wrist pieces from old watch bands and cigarette lighters, soldering them together in a way that made it seem like the webbing was coming from the contraptions, not from his own skin. He didn't want anyone to know the truth. They'd think he was a freak if they knew. The wristbands disguised his biological spinnerets just enough to pass off the silk as a mechanical trick. Standing in front of the mirror, Peter practiced his movements. He posed, flexed, and spun, admiring the way the costume made him look stronger, more imposing. He lowered his voice, trying out lines, rehearsing the confidence that came with this new persona. Spider-Man was born, not from Peter's body, but from his imagination. Spider-Man was everything Peter wasn't. He was bold, fearless, quick with a joke, smooth under pressure. In the mask, Peter felt invincible. The bathroom door creaked open, and Aunt May's voice drifted through. "Peter, when are you going to be done rehearsing? It's late." Peter froze, yanking the mask off his head, his heart pounding. The fantasy dissolved in an instant, and he was just Peter again. Awkward, unsure, and painfully aware of the fragile line between his old life and the new one he was forging. Spider-Man was becoming a sensation, a new star rising in the city. It started when he performed his gravity-defying stunts at a fancy party, showing off by scaling walls and swinging across the room. The guests were amazed, and someone handed him $50 for his trouble. But it didn't stop there. A booking agent in the crowd noticed him and saw potential in Spider-Man's unusual abilities. Soon, Peter found himself invited to a quirky public access variety show, a place for all kinds of strange acts. As the host cracked jokes at his expense, Spider-Man just smiled and played along, eager to please. He shared a bit about his web shooters, saying he'd made them himself, but kept the web formula secret. He mentioned it was similar to something called rayon, but didn't offer more. Meanwhile, deep in the heart of Manhattan, inside a grand mansion with marble floors and priceless art on the walls, a mysterious figure sat in a high-backed chair, watching Spider-Man on one of the many television screens in the room. The screens were his windows to the world, and with a flick of his hand, without even needing a remote, all of them changed to display Spider-Man's latest performance. The man in the chair was Carlton Strand. His sharp eyes gleamed with intelligence, and his presence was one of overwhelming power. Wearing a custom-tailored suit, his hair slicked back, and his platinum watch sparkling under the dim light, Strand was every bit the image of success. Success built, not inherited. "Find out everything you can about this Spider-Man," Strand ordered, his voice cool and commanding. The man he was speaking to, Boyd, a solid-looking guy with a square jaw, nodded and left without a word. While Peter Parker enjoyed his growing fame as Spider-Man, Strand, once just an ordinary criminal named Carl, was plotting something much bigger. 10 years ago, Carl had been a nobody, running from the law with a failed robbery, and his life was about to change forever. It was a dark and stormy night in the New Mexico desert. Carl had been driving fast, the wind whipping sand across the highway, and the flashing red and blue lights of the police grew closer behind him. In the back seat, his partner Bobby was bleeding, shot, and barely hanging on. Carl's eyes were wide with fear and desperation. The police were closing in, and Carl's stolen car was losing ground. With nowhere left to run, he abandoned the vehicle, sprinting into the wild desert. Soon, he stumbled upon a strange field of tall metal towers. These were no ordinary towers. They were part of a sculpture designed to attract lightning. Exhausted, Carl hid among them just as a storm rolled in. Suddenly, lightning struck the field. The metal towers glowed as electricity leaped between them, creating a dazzling display. Carl was caught in the middle of it, struck by bolts of lightning from every direction. The electric charge lifted him off the ground, coursing through his body. It was unlike anything any human had ever experienced. His clothes smoldered, and the stolen money he carried burst into flames, scattering like ash in the wind. The police, watching from a distance, were sure Carl was done for. But when morning came and the storm had passed, Carl did something incredible. He got up. Dazed but alive, Carl soon realized that he had changed. He could now generate and control electricity, channeling it with his bare hands. His body had become like a living battery, and with his new powers, he started his life over. Carl Strand went from being a small-time crook to someone much more dangerous. He built a vast empire using his ability to control electrical energy, not just for physical power, but to manipulate information, steal data, and control everything from bank accounts to corporate secrets. To him, the world wasn't made of solid objects. It was a web of electrical signals, and he could feel them all. But Strand's powers came with a price. He could no longer touch another person without risking their life. Even a simple handshake could be deadly, and any moment of weakness could cause him to harm those he cared about. This loneliness haunted him, a reminder that while he had everything in the world, he could never have the one thing he truly wanted: human connection. And so, Strand sat in his mansion, a man with incredible power, but utterly alone. Chapter 4. There are others like you. Peter Parker was struggling. His grades were slipping, and he wasn't sleeping much these days. Balancing two lives was exhausting, and it was starting to show. Yet, there was one thing that still captured his attention: biology. He threw himself into reading everything he could about spiders, telling himself it was for his term project. His partner, Mary Jane, wasn't too thrilled. She wasn't shy about how much she hated the idea. Spiders? Gross. She thought Peter was a total geek for volunteering them to study something so creepy. But Peter tried to change her mind, explaining how amazing spiders truly were. "Did you know," Peter said, eyes bright with excitement, "that spider silk is stronger than steel for its size? They can even change how sticky or thin their webs are, depending on what they need." Mary Jane scrunched her nose, unimpressed. "And some spiders take care of their young," Peter continued. "They can tell the difference between the movements of their babies and predators. Some even feed their spiderlings with food they've already eaten." Mary Jane cringed. "That's disgusting, Peter." But somehow, despite her disgust, Peter managed to make her laugh. Maybe she didn't find spiders fascinating, but she was starting to like him a little more. One afternoon, as they were leaving school together, Flash Thompson showed up. He was always looking for someone to bully, and today, Peter was his target. Flash ridiculed him, pushing Peter's patience to the limit. But Peter just clenched his jaw and backed away. Violence wasn't his thing. He'd never thrown a punch in his life. Peter tried to stay calm, but then he saw Flash grab Mary Jane's arm, spinning her around. They were arguing, and in a fit of anger, Flash slapped her across the face. Something inside Peter snapped. Without thinking, he clenched his hands around a nearby tree branch, snapping it in two without realizing. Later that evening, Flash was walking to his car after gymnastics practice. It was dark, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Out of nowhere, a figure dropped down silently behind him. Flash spun around and saw a guy in a black mask. Thinking it was a robbery, Flash swung his fist, only to pull back in pain. It felt like he had just punched solid wood. The masked figure, Peter, though Flash had no idea, grabbed Flash with one hand and slapped him hard. "How do you like it?" Peter said, his voice dark. He slapped Flash again, before rearing back and delivering a punch so strong it sent Flash flying 10 feet across the pavement. Peter marched over to him, his anger boiling over. He twisted Flash's arm painfully and dragged him to his shiny Porsche, slamming him against the car. Peter wasn't finished. In his fury, he grabbed a nearby signpost and pounded the car until it was a crumpled mess of broken glass and metal. He leaned in close to Flash, his voice low and menacing. "Stay away from Mary Jane. Or else." Then Peter ran. He didn't stop until he was around the corner, out of sight. Panting heavily, he looked down at his hands, shaking as he rubbed his knuckles. What had he just done? "I wonder if every hero remembers their first punch," Peter thought. "I sure do. All those years of bullies pushing me around. It all came out so fast, it scared me. For a moment, I actually wanted to hurt him more. It's a good thing his car was there. I always hated that Porsche." Peter caught his breath, but the feeling of power, the raw energy running through him, it was unsettling. It was as if something inside him had been unleashed, something dark and uncontrollable. He didn't recognize himself anymore. But the strangest part? Hitting Flash had felt good. Later, Peter took the subway into Manhattan. He changed into his Spider-Man suit in a restroom and soon he was swinging across the city's rooftops. The towering skyscrapers of Manhattan became his playground, as he soared between them, high above the bustling streets below. He moved with grace and ease, like the city's shadows had become his companions. From above, Peter watched the city's secrets unfold, a man yelling at his children, a woman working out in her apartment, someone crying alone, and a mother playing with her baby. Peter, just 17, couldn't make sense of it all. The wealth, the pain, the joy, all packed together in the concrete maze of the city. Why did some people have so much, while others had so little? Hours later, Peter climbed back into his bedroom window. It was 2 a.m., and he was exhausted. He barely had time to sit on his bed before the door creaked open. Uncle Ben stepped in, not turning on the light. He sat down in the chair across from Peter, a quiet sigh escaping him. "I know I'm not the best at this whole father thing, Pete," Ben started. "You came into my life when I was already past my prime. And I know you're dealing with things now that I can't really help with much. But I want you to know, May and I are here for you. Whatever it is, you can talk to us." Peter looked at his uncle, noticing his hands shaking ever so slightly. He was touched, but how could he explain what was going on inside his head? There was no way Ben would understand the Spider-Man side of things. Peter didn't even fully understand it himself. He gave his uncle a small smile and assured him everything was fine. Ben left the room, though Peter could tell he wasn't convinced. Once alone, Peter unbuttoned his shirt, revealing the Spider-Man costume beneath. He pulled out the mask from his back pocket, staring at it. The eyes on the mask seemed to stare back, almost like they knew the weight of the responsibility he carried. Spider-Man clung to the side of a towering high-rise, his senses sharp, as he peered through a nearby window. Inside, a man and a woman were arguing, their voices muffled but the tension unmistakable. Suddenly, the man's face twisted with rage, and he lashed out, striking the woman with the back of his hand. Peter's heart sank. He hated this. He hated watching helpless people get hurt. The woman cried out, trying to escape, but the man grabbed her again. His fist rose, ready to strike once more, but before he could land another blow, he felt something clamp down on his wrist. Confused, he spun around. There, standing between him and the woman, was a masked figure, Spider-Man. Without hesitation, Peter threw a punch. The man crumpled to the floor, knocked out cold. For a moment, Peter felt good. Really good. This was what it was all about, wasn't it? Standing up for the helpless, stopping the bad guys. It felt like justice. But then, something unexpected happened. Peter heard a loud crash and felt a sharp pain on the back of his head. He stumbled forward, turning in disbelief. "Leave my husband alone," the woman shrieked, clutching a frying pan, ready to hit him again. Peter blinked in confusion. Her husband? Now both the woman and the man, who had regained consciousness, were ganging up on him. Peter stumbled back, bewildered. He'd come to help, but now they were both attacking him. People, he realized, were far more complicated than he thought. Sure, he had the strength, the speed, the power, but the wisdom? That part would take time. A few days later, Peter found himself drawn to Mary Jane, the girl he had admired for years. Spying from a distance, he saw her home life up close for the first time. Her parents, mean-spirited and constantly angry, yelled at her for the smallest things. Mary Jane's smile, the one she wore so confidently at school, was nowhere to be found here. Instead, she looked small and broken, trapped in a world of unhappiness. Peter's heart ached for her. Behind her mask of popularity, She was just as lonely as he was. In that moment, he saw the parallels in their lives, both hiding behind masks, both longing for something better. Peter's life took a surprising turn when he got invited to perform on a syndicated variety show. The host introduced Spider-Man, and for a beat, the audience sat in confused silence. Then, from the ceiling, Peter swung down in full costume, sending the crowd into a frenzy of cheers and screams. He performed dazzling acrobatics, flipping through the air, shooting webs, and landing with the grace of a seasoned pro. For a moment, Spider-Man wasn't just a secret hero. He was a star. After the show, as Peter was heading backstage, a woman stepped out of the shadows. She was the most beautiful person Peter had ever seen. Her name was Cordelia, and with a mysterious smile, she handed him a note. It read, "There are others like you." Peter's heart skipped a beat. The note had an address and a time for a meeting. But when he looked up, Cordelia was gone, disappearing into the night. He ran outside, catching a glimpse of her stepping into a sleek limo. He sprinted after the car, but just as he reached it, something stopped him. A massive hand grabbed Peter's shoulder, spinning him around. Standing before him was a tall, burly man in a trench coat and hat pulled low over his eyes. His grip was strong, too strong. Peter tried to pull away, but the man's hand was like iron. Without thinking, Peter swung his fist at the man's gut, expecting him to go down like anyone else. Instead, Peter's fist sank into the man's stomach and kept going. Peter yanked his hand back, horrified to see it covered in sand. "What the?" Peter muttered, his mind racing. Before he could process what was happening, the man, Boyd, slammed a punch into Peter's jaw. It felt like being hit by a brick wall. Peter stumbled backward, his head spinning. Boyd wasn't just strong, he was something else, something unnatural. He could turn his body into sand or rock at will, hardening his fists like concrete. Peter had never faced anything like this. Boyd followed up with a roundhouse punch, sending Peter crashing into the alley wall. Another gut punch doubled him over, leaving Peter gasping for breath. Dazed but determined, Peter pushed himself up, anger flaring. He let out a yell and threw all his strength into a punch aimed right at Boyd's face. But instead of landing solidly, his fist went straight through the man's head in an explosion of white sand. Boyd's face reformed, the grains of sand pulling back together, and he brushed his lapel as if nothing had happened. Then he laughed, a low, eerie sound that sent chills down Peter's spine. Slowly, Boyd's entire body dissolved into sand, slipping through the cracks in the pavement. His coat and hat fluttered to the ground, the only signs he had ever been there, save for a few grains of sand swirling in the wind. Peter stood in the alley, dumbfounded. He wasn't alone. There were others out there with strange powers like his. But if they were all like this Sandman, it wasn't a comforting thought. Peter limped away, back to where he had hidden his clothes, still shaken by what he had just encountered. The world of heroes and villains, he realized, was far more dangerous and far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The next day, Peter discovered that making money as Spider-Man was far more difficult than he'd imagined. The TV shows couldn't pay him cash directly, so he had to rely on a sleazy booking agent to cash the checks for him. Peter's heart sank as he thought about it, but he had no other options. He asked Uncle Ben to drive him to the agent's office, coming up with a flimsy excuse for why he needed to go. When they arrived, Peter got out of the car and made his way inside, slipping into a restroom to change into his Spider-Man costume. He stared at his reflection in the mirror for a moment, the mask concealing his unease. It should have felt good to be Spider-Man, to have these powers. But right now, he just felt like a kid in over his head. Peter entered the agent's dingy office, expecting to get his money. Instead, the agent greeted him with a sour expression. "I'm out of business, kid," the agent spat. "No money? Beat it." Peter's fists clenched, frustration boiling inside him. "What about my pay?" The agent sneered. "Go ahead, call the cops if you want. I'm sure they'll be happy to help you. The second you take off that stupid mask and show them some ID." Peter froze. He couldn't risk it. He didn't want anyone to know who Spider-Man really was, not just for himself, but for Aunt May and Uncle Ben. He couldn't bear the thought of them being humiliated if people knew he was different. As long as his identity stayed a secret, people could believe the web shooters were just gadgets, not something he couldn't remove. Dejected, Peter turned to leave, but as he stepped into the hallway, he saw something that made him stop. A robbery was happening right there on the same floor. The thief, wearing a ski mask, caught Peter's eye, and for a split second, they stared at each other. Two masked figures, sizing each other up. Peter noticed a cobra tattoo on the man's hand. Before he could react, the thief bolted down the stairs. A security guard, out of breath and hopelessly outmatched, ran up and recognized Spider-Man. "Hey, go get him!" the guard wheezed, pointing down the stairwell. "I can't catch him." Peter shrugged, his heart heavy. "It's not my job," he muttered, walking away. He changed back into his regular clothes and made his way to the parking lot, where Uncle Ben was waiting. But when Peter got there, something was wrong. A small crowd had gathered around a body lying on the ground. Panic rising in his chest, Peter pushed his way through the people, only to see his Uncle Ben lying motionless, blood staining his shirt. "Uncle Ben?" Peter whispered, dropping to his knees beside him. His uncle had been shot in the chest by a carjacker who had stolen the car. Peter watched, helpless, as Uncle Ben took his last breath. The ambulance arrived too late. He was gone. The senselessness of it crushed Peter. A random crime, impossible to predict. But Peter couldn't let it go. Guilt and grief turned into obsession as he set out to find the man who had killed his uncle. For the first time, Peter used his powers not for money, not for fame, but for justice. He began a one-man manhunt, using his Spider-Man abilities to spy on the police and follow leads they missed. After days of searching, Peter tracked the killer down to an abandoned warehouse. With grim determination, he swung into the room, landing silently behind the man. The killer turned around, and Peter felt a cold chill. It was him, the man from the hallway, the one with the cobra tattoo. The killer grinned when he saw Spider-Man. "Well, well, the freak in tights. We keep bumping into each other, don't we?" Before Peter could respond, the man whipped out a gun and fired. Without thinking, Peter dodged the bullet, his reflexes faster than he'd ever imagined. The killer fired again and again, but Spider-Man moved like lightning, flipping and leaping across the room. In one swift move, Peter shot his web, yanking the gun out of the killer's hands. He lunged forward, slamming the man against the wall. Peter's hands shook as he grabbed the man's shirt, pulling back his fist to deliver a punch that could crush bone. He wanted to. He needed to. But just as he was about to strike, his eyes caught sight of the cobra tattoo on the man's hand. A flash of memory hit him. The thief running past him in the building, the security guard begging him to stop the man, and Peter walking away. Peter's chest tightened with guilt. If he had stopped this man then, Uncle Ben would still be alive. He had the power, the speed, the strength to do it. but he hadn't used it responsibly. The crushing weight of that realization pressed down on him. Peter lowered his fist, his anger draining away. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could make sure this man didn't hurt anyone else. He shot webbing all over the killer, binding him tightly. Moments later, Peter swung down into the path of a police car, the headlights illuminating his figure. He dropped the bound killer onto the hood, and, with a voice shaking with pain, told them, "He's the one. He killed Ben Parker." But instead of gratitude, the cops looked at Spider-Man with suspicion. The killer began yelling, "This guy's crazy. He tied me up. Help!" The cops turned to Peter. "Take off the mask," one of them ordered. Peter shook his head. "I can't." "Then come down to the station with us," the cop insisted, pulling out handcuffs. Peter bristled. He had brought them the murderer, and now he was the one being treated like a criminal. When they tried to cuff him, Peter snapped. He broke the handcuffs easily, tossing the cops aside. They scrambled for their guns, but before they could fire, Peter leapt into the darkness, swinging away into the night. As he vanished onto a rooftop, the bruised and bewildered officers were left staring after him, amazed. Chapter 5. Juvenile Persona. That night, a local TV station ran a headline that would change everything. The Evening News, owned by J. Jonah Jameson, broke the story. 2 police officers had been attacked by the mysterious figure known as Spider-Man. Peter watched in disbelief as the news painted him as a menace. Jameson, with his booming voice and scowling face, seemed determined to turn the whole city against him. It wasn't long before Spider-Man's feud with both the police and the media mogul began. Jameson would go on to criticize and attack Spider-Man at every opportunity, turning him into public enemy number 1. But Peter had bigger concerns. His uncle was gone, taken by senseless violence, and Peter couldn't stand by and watch the world crumble around him. He took to the streets, determined to make things right. Every night, he became Spider-Man, hunting down criminals with a fierce dedication that scared even him sometimes. The once shy, bullied kid had transformed into a relentless force, bringing down crooks faster than the police could keep up. Spider-Man was becoming a legend, a one-man crime wave, but not everyone saw him as a hero. The city was split. Some people, especially those he'd saved, were grateful. But others, including the police and Jameson, feared him, seeing him as a vigilante taking the law into his own hands. One night, while swinging through the city, Spider-Man stumbled upon a terrible scene. 2 police officers were roughing up a man, and it didn't look right. Without thinking, Peter intervened. He webbed up the officers, stopping the beating in its tracks. But in doing so, he crossed a line. Now, Spider-Man wasn't just misunderstood. He was officially a wanted criminal. Peter's heart sank. He had tried to do the right thing, but now the very people he thought he could help were after him. It became clear that justice wasn't always about wearing a badge or following the rules. It was something deeper, something that Peter had to figure out for himself. With the police hunting him, Peter couldn't make any more public appearances as Spider-Man to earn money. He was back to square one, broke, outcast, and unsure of his next move. He felt like the world was closing in on him. No one understood him, and there was no one to turn to for guidance. He was alone, facing decisions that no one else could make for him. He thought about giving it all up, ignoring his powers, trying to live a normal life. But every time he thought about walking away, the memory of Uncle Ben's death haunted him. His uncle's words echoed in his mind. With great power comes great responsibility. Peter knew he couldn't ignore the world around him. He had to use his gifts. But how? The police didn't trust him. The media vilified him. And the criminals wanted him gone for good. J. Jonah Jameson made sure Spider-Man stayed in the headlines, twisting the story and stirring up fear. He portrayed Spider-Man as a dangerous vigilante, lurking in the shadows like a spider, waiting to strike. And fear was good for business. It boosted ratings, kept people talking, and made Spider-Man seem like a bigger threat than ever. Meanwhile, the real criminals weren't happy either. Gangs, mobsters, drug dealers, they all wanted Spider-Man out of the way. He was hurting their operations, making it harder for them to control the streets. And now, they all had their eyes on him, waiting for the chance to take him down. But in some neighborhoods, Spider-Man was becoming a legend. Crime was dropping, and people started seeing him as a protector, someone who cared about their safety. Kids looked up to him, and everyone wanted to believe Spider-Man was one of them. In different parts of the city, people claimed him as their own. "He's gotta be black," some kids said, watching his acrobatic moves. "No way a white dude's that cool." "Nah, my brother talked to him once," someone else chimed in. "He's definitely Hispanic." Others insisted he was Italian, while some thought he might even be gay. Everyone had their own version of Spider-Man, their own idea of who was behind the mask, but none of them really knew. Peter Parker, a kid from Queens, was struggling with what it meant to be Spider-Man. He wanted to protect people, to make the world a better place, but it was getting harder every day. The city might be divided on who Spider-Man was, but Peter wasn't sure who he was anymore either. As Peter worked alongside Mary Jane to finish their science project, he couldn't help but notice how she talked about Spider-Man. Her eyes lit up as she described the mysterious hero, someone she saw as courageous and noble, full of conviction. There was a spark in her voice as she admitted she could relate to Spider-Man's need for a mask, for keeping his true self hidden from the world. Peter's heart raced. How he longed to tell her that he was Spider-Man, to reveal the truth. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when he was being hunted by the police, branded a criminal by the media. The truth would only put her in danger. Later that day, Peter quietly followed Mary Jane after school, staying out of sight. She walked alone, heading toward a secluded place she often went to be by herself. None of her friends knew about it, but Peter did. From a distance, he watched her, perched high above, hidden in the shadows. As she walked home, Peter noticed a group of rough-looking punks trailing behind her. His heart sank. They closed in, surrounding her, their intentions clear. Mary Jane screamed, struggling as they dragged her toward an abandoned junkyard. There was no one else around. She was helpless. And then, Spider-Man swooped down. In a blur of web and fists, Peter made quick work of the attackers, trouncing them with ease. Once they were webbed up, he loomed over them, his voice sharp with warning. "If I see you worthless chunks of vomit around here again," he growled, "I'll decorate my Christmas tree with your intestines. Got it?" The punks nodded, terrified. They wouldn't be causing trouble again anytime soon. Turning to Mary Jane, Spider-Man gently lifted her into his arms. She clung to him as he shot a web into the sky, launching them both into the air. They swung from rooftop to rooftop, soaring through the night. For Mary Jane, it was like stepping into a dream, a wild, breathtaking adventure she'd never forget. He brought her to the top of the world, literally. They landed on the stainless steel globe from the 1964 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows Park. There, in the glow of the moonlight, they sat together. Mary Jane, still in awe, melted against him, and for a moment, Peter felt invincible. The mask gave him confidence, allowing him to be someone he wasn't brave enough to be as Peter Parker. He leaned in, and through the fabric of his mask, he kissed her. It was tender, soft, and perfect, a moment Peter wished could last forever. But his world was about to change once again. Later, Spider-Man arrived at a rendezvous point where he was met by Cordelia and Strand. This marked the beginning of something far bigger than Peter had anticipated, the most important relationship of his journey. Strand, charismatic and enigmatic, was searching for others like him, people touched by fate, elevated by some cosmic accident. Strand recounted how he had discovered Boyd, a man with the newfound ability to transform his body into sand. Once just a low-paid maintenance worker, Boyd had been working at a military research facility that experimented with quantum physics, specifically a phenomenon called bilocation, teleportation through space. During a routine repair job, Boyd had been caught in a catastrophic accident when the facility's collider malfunctioned, fusing his molecules with the sand beneath his feet. The results were unimaginable. Boyd could now transubstantiate, shifting his body into living sand. But this newfound power had turned Boyd from a mean-spirited man into a dangerous criminal. Boyd had been trapped by his own creation, and when the facility's doctors tried to lock him away for study, he escaped, dissolving into sand and slipping under doors. He was unstoppable, and worse, angry. Flashbacks of Boyd's rampages haunted Peter. Boyd robbing an armored car, bullets passing through his sand-like body as if he weren't even there. His fists turned into solid sledgehammers, pounding through steel doors as if they were paper. This was the kind of power Peter was up against. Boyd, now known as the Sandman, was just the beginning. And Peter knew he had to face these extraordinary threats, no matter the cost. Boyd sat in a dingy hotel room, hiding out after the robbery. Stacks of cash lay haphazardly on the dresser, remnants of his latest haul. Next to him in bed, a tough-looking girl shifted uncomfortably, brushing sand from the sheets with a look of disgust. She hated the sand, Boyd's constant, unshakable companion since the accident. He took another swig of vodka, straight from the bottle, his expression dark. He was on edge, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Tossing the empty bottle aside, he stumbled across the room, searching for another. Behind him, the girl barely glanced up, still preoccupied with the gritty sand beneath her. A knock on the door snapped Boyd from his daze. He approached cautiously, his instincts screaming danger. Opening it a crack, he saw Strand standing there, calm and composed. Strand's voice was smooth as he recounted how he had found Boyd, taken him in, and showed him a better way. A way to make real money, far beyond petty robberies. Now, Boyd was Strand's enforcer, his right-hand man. Strand apologized for Boyd's behavior the other night, but explained it was necessary to get Spider-Man's attention. He had been curious, after all, to see if the hero had the guts to fight back against someone as powerful as Boyd. As Peter listened to Strand, he realized how much he had changed. The mask had changed him. He had fought back. His anger had taken control, and in that anger, he'd found a new kind of fearlessness. But what did Strand want from him? Strand, though unaware of Peter's true identity, seemed to sense his youth, his vulnerability. He wanted to mentor Spider-Man, to bring him under his wing, and teach him the ways of the world. And Peter, longing for guidance, was tempted. Strand spoke with such brilliance, his words dripping with wisdom honed over years of contemplating his own powers. Everything he said made so much sense to Peter. Strand believed they were not freaks, but extraordinary individuals, linked by fate and elevated above the masses by some cosmic accident. That was why he had sought out Boyd, the Sandman, and now wanted Spider-Man to join them. Out of billions, they were special, not bystanders in the world's evolution, but its masters, shaped by flukes of technology into something greater. This, according to Strand, was the next step in human evolution. Strand invited Peter to his mansion in Manhattan. Peter had never seen such wealth. Millions of dollars worth of art, antiques, and luxuries surrounded him. Strand sipped a martini, his fingers idly stroking the electric eels in an enormous aquarium. Peter was mesmerized, his gaze flicking around the room, awestruck by the opulence. "You know," Strand mused, swirling his drink, "the whole Spider-Man costume and persona. It's a bit juvenile, isn't it? Who are you, really?" Peter stiffened, the question hanging in the air. Strand wanted him to take off the mask, to reveal himself, but Peter couldn't. Not yet. Not here. Strand didn't push the issue. Instead, he expanded on his vision of the special ones, the extraordinary few destined to rise above the ignorant, vicious herd. In Strand's view, evolution favored the predators, not the weak, grazing masses. Noble creatures like wolves and lions ruled the top of the food chain, and so too should those with power, like Spider-Man. "We honor competition, right?" Strand asked, his voice hypnotic. "We honor winners. But for every winner, there must be 1,000 losers. That's nature. So, ask yourself, are you a winner or a loser?" It was a dangerous seduction, power wrapped in reason, and Peter could feel its pull. Strand was brilliant, misunderstood, and alone, just like Peter. For the first time in a long while, Peter didn't feel like a freak. Strand understood him, even cared about him, offering companionship where Peter had felt only isolation. "We are more than human, you and I," Strand continued, his eyes gleaming. "Not less. We deserve whatever we can take. It's the only law that's real, the law that existed for 500 million years before mankind's laws." Cordelia, one of Strand's companions, sidled up to Peter, her intentions clear, as she tried to coax him to relax. Peter shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, sensing the trap. Strand watched from the sidelines, coolly observing. With a sly smile, he leaned in and whispered, "If you join me, you can have your fill of Cordelias. They come with the territory." To make his point, Strand picked up a light bulb, holding it between two fingers over Peter's head. The bulb flickered to life, glowing with power. "Starting to get the idea, kid?" Strand asked, his voice low and compelling. Peter shook his head, stepping back. "I'm not interested in someone with values that screwed up. And frankly, I'm not sure I like you much either." Strand's eyes narrowed. He had gone too far, too fast, assuming Peter would accept his twisted worldview without hesitation. The illusion shattered when Peter learned the truth. Strand was a crook, and now they were enemies. "You can't afford more enemies, Spider-Man," Strand warned, his tone icy. Before Peter could respond, Strand blasted him with a bolt of energy, sending him flying across the room. Dazed but not beaten, Peter leapt to the ceiling, dodging more blasts. Strand's mansion erupted into chaos, as each missed shot obliterated priceless art and antiques. The destruction only fueled Strand's frustration. Boyd entered the fray, intensifying the carnage. Peter, nearly unconscious from the energy attacks, fired a web line at the massive aquarium, toppling it in an explosion of glass and water. As thousands of gallons cascaded across the room, Strand was shorted out, the electric eels flopping helplessly at his feet. Seizing the moment, Peter dodged Boyd's blows and made his escape, diving through a window into the night. Boyd couldn't follow, leaving Strand to survey the wreckage of his once grand home. Furious but intrigued, Strand picked up a strand of Spider-Man's webbing from the floor. He pulled on it with all his strength but couldn't break it. A slow smile spread across his face. "Interesting," he murmured. Strand wasn't done with Spider-Man yet. His campaign to win him over was just beginning. The next day, Strand bought a major TV station and gave J. Jonah Jameson an unlimited budget to bash Spider-Man relentlessly. "Fixate on Spider-Man," Strand instructed Jameson. "Make him public enemy number one. Trust me, your ratings will soar." Soon, the media was flooded with negative stories, all orchestrated by Strand. He even paid thugs to wear knockoff Spider-Man costumes and commit crimes, turning the public against their former hero. People no longer trusted Spider-Man. When he tried to help, they pushed him away, telling him to get lost. To make matters worse, Peter's costume had been destroyed in the fight with Strand and Sandman. He needed a new one, and fast. Amazingly, he found a replica of his Spider-Man suit in a specialty store for $120. It was even his size. Peter shrugged, buying it without hesitation. At least it was better made than his old one. Chapter 6. Symbolic Bonds. Peter swung from building to building, his usual grace faltering with each leap. His head pounded, his body ached, and the flu clung to him like a parasite. His vision blurred as he landed on a ledge, clutching the rough brick wall for balance. He could feel the nausea rising, and despite his best efforts, he leaned over the edge and vomited onto the fire escape below. A window nearby slid open, and a young boy with wide eyes poked his head out. "Hey, yo, Spidey. Sup, man?" Peter wiped his mouth, his voice strained. "I've got the flu." The kid nodded sagely. "Hey, yeah, it's going around, man." Without waiting for a response, the boy turned back into the apartment. From inside, Peter heard the muffled voice of the kid's mother. "Who you talking to?" "Spidey got the flu, Mama. He pookin' on the fire escape." There was a pause, followed by her loud, unimpressed reply. "Well, you tell him to Spidey his ass on over to the next building and throw up there. Damn, like we don't got enough trouble with the winos in this neighborhood." Peter's heart sank. He was supposed to be a hero, but lately, all he felt was exhaustion, sickness, and ungratefulness from the people he tried so hard to protect. He had sacrificed so much, pushed himself to the brink, and this was the thanks he got? The flu wasn't the worst of it. He had been hitting a string of bad luck lately. Every time he tried to help, it seemed to backfire. Like the time he stopped a robbery, only to find out the thieves were just a group of kids, desperate and scared. Kids just like him, trying to scrape by in a city that never gave anyone a break. One of them panicked, running for the fire escape. Peter had tried to catch him, but he wasn't fast enough. The boy had slipped, falling to the street below. He didn't survive. It had shaken Peter to his core. He wasn't fighting supervillains anymore. He was fighting a city full of pain, of desperation. He saw it in every shadow he swung past, in every window he glanced through. The crimes he faced weren't black and white. The victims and the perpetrators were often one and the same, ground down by a world that didn't care about them. And what was he supposed to do? How could one person make a difference when the city seemed determined to tear itself apart? The weight of it all pressed down on Peter like an avalanche, threatening to bury him alive. He had started to wonder if there were any good people left to save. Maybe they were all just different shades of bad. One night, he had come across a group of drug dealers, webbed them up, and left them for the cops. But as he stood in their apartment, his eyes fell on the pile of cash sitting on the table. $20,000 in 20s and 50s. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life. Aunt May needed that kind of money. She could barely make the house payments on her Social Security check, and with her medical bills piling up, it was becoming impossible. Medicare wouldn't cover the operation she desperately needed. Peter's stomach twisted as he stared at the money. No one would know. The drug dealers wouldn't miss it. They were webbed up and waiting for the cops, who would probably take credit for the bust anyway. It would be so easy. He could help Aunt May, stop her from suffering in pain, maybe even save her life. And what about him? Maybe he could stop riding that moped or taking the bus. Maybe he could buy a car, take a girl out on a real date, show those rich kids at school, those ones with the lawyers and dentists for dads, that he wasn't a loser. The temptation clawed at him. The money was right there. He could take it. No one would ever know. He could be so much more than just a poor kid from Queens. He could have a life, a real life. Peter stood on the edge, teetering between right and wrong. It would be so easy to fall. Atop the towering heights of the city, Spider-Man clung upside down to the steel beams of the World Trade Center, watching over the glowing skyline below. The chaos and lights of New York stretched far and wide, but Peter felt a deep loneliness, even with the city bustling beneath him. His thoughts drifted. "I thought being your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man would get easier as time went on," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper in the wind. "Well, I'm still waiting." In his mind, the challenges were mounting. Below, in a shadowy apartment, he had stood face to face with a drug dealer, stacks of cash piled high on a table. Peter's hand hovered near the money, temptation tugging at him. His eyes met the dealer's, and something inside Peter snapped. "What are you looking at?" he muttered under his breath before leaping out of the window with the money in hand. The cool night air hit his face as he swung away, leaving the weight of his actions behind him. The next morning, the sun rose over a quiet neighborhood, where kids played basketball on cracked asphalt. Chain-link fences surrounded them, and graffiti-covered walls told stories of their own. Without warning, hundreds of dollar bills fluttered down from the sky like green snowflakes. The kids stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with disbelief. In an instant, the neighborhood erupted into celebration, children chasing the bills down the block, laughing and shouting. One of them looked up just in time to catch a glimpse of a red and blue figure swinging between rooftops, disappearing into the distance. "What was I gonna do?" Spider-Man's voice echoed in Peter's mind. "Track down all the people and give the money back? Anyway, there's more than one way to help people. But I've got to tell you, fighting villains like Sandman was easier than letting go of that money." Meanwhile, in the background, forces were closing in. A man named Strand was tracking Spider-Man's movements, analyzing every sighting and incident. He knew which stories were real and which were fabrications meant to tarnish the hero's name. As his analysts plotted Spider-Man's activities on a map of New York City, one fact became clear. Everything seemed to center on Queens. Strand turned to his team with a single command: "Focus the search there." Elsewhere in the city, Mary Jane sat nervously in front of a television camera, speaking from the heart during an interview. She was introduced as a local high school girl who had met and talked with Spider-Man. With passion in her voice, she defended him. "Spider-Man saved me," she declared. "He's kind and gentle. He's a hero. And we should be thankful he's out there." Later that evening, Mary Jane went to her favorite spot by the water, a quiet place where she could think. As she sat, lost in thought, a soft sound from behind startled her. She turned, and there he was, Spider-Man, dropping down silently from above. Her heart raced, a rush of excitement overtaking her as he reached out a hand. "Do you still trust me?" he asked, his voice calm and soothing. Her answer came not with words, but with a kiss, sweet and soft, separated only by the thin fabric of his mask. She could feel his breath on her face as their lips met. "Where are we going?" she whispered. "It's a surprise," Spider-Man replied, a playful grin in his voice. Before she could say anything more, he scooped her into his arms and swung them into the air. The Brooklyn Bridge loomed ahead, a stunning silhouette against the night sky. They soared in graceful arcs, Peter effortlessly shooting webs from rooftop to rooftop. Mary Jane clung to him, laughing with joy, her fear melting away as they flew higher and higher. Her screams of excitement echoed in the night air as they reached the dizzying heights of the bridge's stone tower. Peter set her down gently on the top of the tower, where the city's lights glittered all around them like a blanket of stars. She clung to him, her eyes wide in awe, barely able to believe where she was. The suspension cables radiated outward like the threads of a giant spider's web, and they sat at its very center, surrounded by the magic of the night. Spider-Man stood before her, his silhouette striking against the backdrop of the city. "Courtship among spiders is highly ritualized," he began, his voice low and steady. "It varies from species to species. The male may circle the female or wave his front legs to signal that he's not prey." As he spoke, Peter moved gracefully around her in a slow, hypnotic arc, his hands gesturing in a dance-like motion. "The female usually shows her willingness through calm stillness," he continued. Mary Jane held her breath, her heart racing, her eyes fixed on him. She didn't move, captivated by his presence. "In some spiders, like the crab spider, the male will use silk to gently tie the female's limbs," Peter said, his hands moving with the same delicate precision as he created strands of webbing that glinted in the moonlight. First, one wrist, then the other, always gentle, always respectful. "These bonds aren't meant to hold her," he explained. "They're just symbolic. She can break free whenever she wants." Mary Jane looked up at him, her voice soft but sure. "The male must be brave to trust the female so much." Spider-Man nodded. "Yes, he's bold, but he also trusts her." He moved closer, his voice almost a whisper now. "Close your eyes." She did, and as Peter removed his mask, they shared a tender, gentle kiss high above the world. The city lights twinkled below them, and in that moment, everything felt perfect. The next day at school, Mary Jane felt a lightness she hadn't known before. She sat in the science lab, her fingers lightly tracing the path of a tarantula as it crawled across her arm. She hummed to herself, content. The room was quiet except for her soft tune and the shuffle of books and papers around her. Two of her friends, polished and perfect in their preppy outfits, approached, their faces twisted in disgust. "You, MJ, what are you doing with that thing?" one of them said, stepping back as if the spider might leap onto her next. The other girl wrinkled her nose. "You've been hanging out with Peter Parker way too much. First the science stuff, now the spiders? You're starting to turn into a nerd like him." Mary Jane looked up, smiling easily at them. Their judgment didn't bother her, not anymore. She let the tarantula move to her other arm and laughed, a sound that startled her friends even more. "You know what?" she said, her eyes bright with confidence. "You guys are so full of it." She shook her head, her laughter lingering as they exchanged shocked glances and quickly left the room. She wasn't the same Mary Jane anymore. The need to fit in, the pressure to be like them. It was gone, brushed away like dust. She had found something better, something real. The mask she had worn for so long wasn't important now. She didn't need it. Meanwhile, in the luxurious comfort of Carlton Strand's sprawling living room, a different scene was playing out. Strand sat in an overstuffed chair, his eyes fixed on the shaky, long-lens footage playing on the screen before him. Boyd, his right-hand man, stood nearby, proud of his work. The footage showed Spider-Man dropping down to Mary Jane, startling her, and then, after a few heartbeats, the two shared a kiss. Boyd had caught it all on tape, though the camera wobbled as he had hidden himself in the shadows. The tape ended with Spider-Man lifting Mary Jane into his arms and swinging off into the darkness of the city. "I followed her for 2 days," Boyd said, a smug grin on his face. "Turns out she's Spider-Man's girlfriend." Strand didn't respond at first, just nodded slowly, thinking, his sharp mind already at work. That night, as Mary Jane prepared for bed, something unexpected happened. As she drifted off to sleep, a soft, suffocating cloud pressed over her face. The Sandman had come for her, lulling her into unconsciousness. When the chloroform finally wore off, she awoke in a strange, unfamiliar place, Strand's mansion. She was a prisoner now, alone and scared. When Mary Jane didn't show up at school the next day, Peter grew worried. He rushed to her house, knocking on the door, his heart pounding. Inside, he found her room in disarray. But it was the fine layer of sand on the windowsill that told him everything he needed to know. His pulse quickened. Sandman. Peter's mind raced as he pieced it together. She had been taken, and he had to find her. At that same moment, across town, J. Jonah Jameson aired a tape on the evening news. The footage had been submitted anonymously, and it played out on every screen in the city. The video was the same one Boyd had shown Strand, but it had been edited. The kiss was gone, leaving only the part where Spider-Man dropped down on Mary Jane and then whisked her away. The news anchor spoke in a grim tone. "This newly surfaced footage may be evidence that Spider-Man is behind the disappearance of Mary Jane Watson. Authorities have no other leads at this time." Peter stood frozen for a moment as the news broadcast flashed on a store TV in front of him. The world thought Spider-Man had kidnapped Mary Jane. His heart clenched, but he didn't have time to worry about the rumors. He had to save her. Without hesitation, Peter suited up. Spider-Man took to the skies, his movements swift and determined. He swung from building to building, his web lines catching the light of the city as he soared through the air. Each swing brought him closer, each skyscraper he passed a blur. There was no time to lose. Mary Jane was waiting for him. Chapter 7. It's just Spider-Man. Peter arrived at the grand mansion in Midtown, its towering facade casting long shadows as the day began to dim. The air inside was eerily still as he moved through the expansive rooms, searching frantically. He couldn't find them. His heart pounded, dread rising in his chest. Then he found her. Cordelia lay lifeless on the cold floor. Strand hadn't bothered to revive her after their final kiss, too pressed for time, too focused on his escape. Peter's gaze flicked to the enormous bank of TV monitors lining the wall. Each one displayed the same frozen image. Strand's face, grinning, paused in a moment of mocking triumph. A VCR whirred softly beneath them, Peter hit play. The scene sprang to life. Strand appeared, dragging MJ into view. His voice echoed in the hollow silence of the mansion. "Meet me at the top of the World Trade Center." Peter barely had time to process the message before the doors were kicked in with brutal force. SWAT team members stormed the room, weapons drawn. It was another trap, perfectly laid. They saw Spider-Man standing over Cordelia's body. It looked bad. Too bad. "Sorry, boys. Can't stay," Peter muttered. The guns fired. Instinctively, he moved, leaping, spinning, ducking. The room became a blur of movement as he narrowly dodged the hail of bullets. He vaulted into the air, arcing across the room in one powerful swing. Glass shattered as he crashed through the skylight, shards glittering around him as he plummeted. Mid-air, Peter shot a web. It caught the edge of a flagpole, and he swung across the street just as a police helicopter roared toward him. The rotor blades sliced through his web, severing it cleanly. He fell. 10 stories flashed by in a heartbeat. Desperate, he shot another web, missed, then fired again. The strand held, snapping him back up in a wild bungee-like rebound. At blinding speed, he whipped toward a horizontal flagpole jutting from a nearby building, using its momentum to launch himself across the street. Now, he was in his element, the city sprawling beneath him as he swung effortlessly through the concrete jungle. Spider-Man was back in the groove, gliding above the chaos with the ease of someone born to soar. The news blared across every channel. Spider-Man was now the city's most wanted man. The headlines painted him as a fugitive, responsible for a litany of crimes. The daring escape from the police, the abduction of Mary Jane Watson, and now the murder of Cordelia. Each incident piled up like bricks in a wall, cementing the growing public suspicion against him. Live feeds from helicopters buzzed over the city, showing police cars swarming the streets. Helicopters circled above, their spotlights cutting through the night. One chopper even caught a fleeting glimpse of Spider-Man as he darted between the towering buildings, a red and blue blur against the dark canyon of steel. But just as quickly, he vanished from their sights. Peter's heart pounded as he reached the base of the World Trade Center towers. He wasted no time. He began to climb, his body moving with a speed and urgency that surpassed anything he'd ever done before. The sheer metal face of the building glinted beneath his fingers as he raced upward, the weight of the city's accusations and his own desperation propelling him higher. With a shattering crash, he burst through the glass of the observation deck, landing inside the empty, closed-off space. There, amid the silence of the sky-high room, Strand stood. MJ was in his grasp, her face pale but defiant. "Let her go," Peter demanded, his voice tight with rage. Strand shrugged, a casual, dismissive gesture. "I don't care about her now that you're here." He let go of MJ, as if she had never mattered. She stumbled, but quickly moved toward Spider-Man, relief flooding her face. "She was just the bait." Peter tensed as Strand approached, his every move deliberate. With a sweeping motion, Strand gestured to the vast city spread out below them, twinkling like a sea of diamonds under the night sky. It was as if he was presenting Peter with the world, a kingdom laid at his feet. "Relax, kid. I just want to talk," Strand said, his voice smooth. "About what?" Spider-Man's tone was sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. "About you." Strand's eyes gleamed as he spoke. "About your career. Think of me as a kind of guidance counselor. Now, let's consider your chosen field. Heroism. Bad choice, if you ask me. I'm recommending against it." Peter's fists clenched. "It's not up to you." Strand strolled to the window, his hands resting on his hips as he looked down at the world below, with the air of someone who believed he owned it all. "Think about it," he continued, his voice thoughtful. "You can't save the world. Why? Because you can't save people from themselves, from their own brutality, their greed. You're either a predator or prey in this world, a killer or a victim." Peter's gaze didn't waver as Strand's words slithered through the air. "People are violent, stupid, confused. Why waste your gifts on them? They'd love nothing more than to see your mask ripped off, to watch you drag through the mud. The only thing they love more than a hero is to see that hero fall, to see him fail, screw up, get caught in some scandal. You know why? It lets them feel better about their own pathetic lives." Strand turned slowly to face Peter, his eyes dark and knowing. His voice dropped to a near whisper, hypnotic. "It's a myth that people need heroes. They hate heroes. Heroes make them feel small, inadequate. Every day, the media feeds them stories of heroes who are just as flawed as they are, just as twisted inside. It comforts them. It reassures them that they aren't the only ones failing. That's what lets them sleep at night." MJ glanced at Spider-Man, her face etched with concern. From her angle, she couldn't see his expression behind the mask, but she could sense his uncertainty. Inside, Peter's mind was racing, Strand's words worming their way into his thoughts, planting seeds of doubt. Strand stepped closer, his presence overpowering. "Misery loves company, and everyone's miserable. You run around in that costume, acting like some holier-than-thou saint. But the truth is, they hate you for it. You're setting yourself up for a fall." He was now inches from Peter, his eyes locking onto the mask. "I want this to work out," he said softly, his voice almost kind. "You're a smart kid. Like those fake bracelets of yours. Clever idea." Peter's stomach lurched. His heart raced with sudden alarm. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Strand smiled and placed his hands on Peter's shoulders, as if offering guidance. Strand's voice was low and steady as he spoke, a sinister calm lacing his words. "Son, I know your secret." He took a step closer, eyes narrowing in a predatory way. "See? I had the web material you left all over my living room analyzed. It's real spider silk." Without warning, Strand grabbed Peter's wrist, yanking it up with surprising force. In one swift motion, he ripped off the fake web shooters Peter had worn for so long. He stared at Peter's exposed wrist, bending it back just enough to reveal the small spinneret beneath his skin. A part of Peter that wasn't human. Mary Jane's eyes widened at the sight, her face draining of color. Her shock hit Peter harder than any punch he'd ever taken. He saw the fear creeping into her expression, a fear that wasn't for her safety, but of him. It was in that moment Peter felt his will start to crumble. Everything in her gaze was shifting, and he knew what she was thinking. He wasn't just Peter Parker anymore. He wasn't fully human. He was a freak. "You can take off the costume," Strand said, his voice a dark whisper, "but you will always be the Spider-Man." Peter's jaw tightened. "It's just Spider-Man." Strand shrugged, dismissing the correction. "The point is, you're not a hero. You're a spider. It's not a choice. You can't escape it. Spiders are hunters, Peter. They survive by killing. They aren't held back by morals or delusions of doing what's right. They are powerful, efficient. They are what nature intended." Peter's stomach twisted at Strand's words, but he couldn't deny the strange logic. It was cold, cruel, but it made a terrible kind of sense. "There are no merciful spiders," Strand continued, turning to the window again, this time draping an arm around Peter's shoulders, as if they were father and son. Together, they looked down at the vast city below, lights stretching out to the horizon. The world was at their feet, and for a fleeting moment, Peter felt the weight of Strand's offer. "Join me, Peter," Strand said softly, his voice coaxing. "Together, we could take this world and make it ours. We could claim what's rightfully yours. You've been given a gift, a great, unimaginable gift. Don't waste it." Peter's mind swirled in a whirlwind of thoughts. He stared out at the glittering city below, his heart heavy with the confusion that had been building inside him for so long. What Strand said made so much sense. It explained the restlessness, the churning chaos in his mind, the frustration he could never quite shake. For a moment, he stood there, lost in thought, wondering if perhaps Strand was right. Strand made a casual gesture toward Boyd, who stepped into the shadows, approaching a large, covered shape. It was about the size of 2 refrigerators, draped in a thick tarp. With a smooth motion, Boyd pulled it back, revealing what was underneath. Stacks of money. Neatly piled and bound, bank-slipped hundreds rising in towers of cash. The pile was enormous, 6 feet tall and 8 feet long, gleaming under the dim lights. Mary Jane gasped at the sight. Strand smiled, clearly enjoying her reaction. "I don't often carry cash," he said with a hint of amusement. "But I thought Boyd should bring some for demonstration purposes. Far more dramatic than a boring bank statement, don't you think?" Mary Jane couldn't tear her eyes away. "How much is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Strand turned to Boyd, raising an eyebrow. "Well, what is it, Boyd?" 250, Boyd answered. 1,000, Mary Jane ventured, unsure. Strand's expression shifted, almost insulted by the suggestion. "1,000,000, dear girl. 1,000,000. It's all I could gather on short notice." He turned his attention back to Spider-Man, his tone becoming more serious. "Of course, this is pocket change compared to what you and I could accomplish together. It's all out there, just waiting for us. All we have to do is take it." He gestured to the money. "You know how I get this? It's just fractions. Half a cent here, half a cent there. Electronic transactions happening millions of times a second, all over the world. No one notices. That's the beauty of it." Peter remained silent for a moment, the weight of Strand's words pressing down on him. Then, in a low voice, he replied, "I took some money once. It was easy, just sitting there. It felt like the solution to everything, and there was no one to stop me. I could have walked away with it all." Strand raised an eyebrow. "And what did you discover?" "That there's a line you don't cross," Peter said, his voice firm. "And sometimes you only find that line after you've already crossed it. But once you do, you always know exactly where it is." Strand scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, please, don't tell me you gave it back." Peter shrugged. "More or less." Strand's smile faltered. "What a disappointment." Spider-Man met his gaze, standing tall. "You want to talk about fate? Maybe there's a reason for all of this. Maybe I'm here to stop guys like you when no one else will." Boyd snorted, glancing at Peter's suit. Pretty tough talk for someone wearing tights. Without warning, Strand lunged forward and grabbed Mary Jane, pulling her away before Peter could react. In an instant, a surge of energy coursed through her, making her body tense up. Peter leaped toward them, but Strand tightened his grip, increasing the voltage. Mary Jane cried out in pain. Peter froze, his heart pounding. He stood helpless, watching as Strand toyed with her life. Strand cruelly grabbed her by the head and kissed her, the electrical current making her hair shoot out wildly. She writhed, her body jerking uncontrollably. "See how power excites them?" Strand sneered. He broke the kiss, but not before Mary Jane regained her strength enough to slap him across the face. Unfazed, Strand kissed her again, this time with even more power coursing through her, making her convulse wildly. Peter's mind raced, searching for a way to stop him, before it was too late. Meanwhile, Sandman had dissolved into a grainy flow, slithering across the floor like liquid earth. Quietly, he reformed behind Peter, his body hardening into a hulking shape of solid rock. Before Peter could react, Sandman's massive stone hands clamped down on him, trapping him in an unbreakable grip. Peter struggled, his body twisting in a desperate attempt to break free, but it was no use. All he could do was watch in horror as Strand continued his cruel torment. Strand's electrical energy surged through Mary Jane's body. She bucked violently under the current, then fell unnervingly still. Her head lolled back, and Peter's heart sank as he saw her lifeless eyes, pupils wide and unresponsive. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. She was gone. Dead. Peter's breath caught in his throat, rage bubbling up from the deepest parts of him. Strand smirked, stepping away casually. What do you think? Should we call 911? I'll kill you." Peter's voice was raw, almost unrecognizable. His whole body shook with fury. "You hear me? You're dead. You sick." "See?" Strand interrupted, grinning as if he'd won some twisted game. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You are a killer, Peter. It's inside you. Why fight it? You want to rip me apart right now, don't you?" Strand casually placed his hand on Mary Jane's chest, sending a pulse of energy into her. Her body jerked violently, but then her chest began to move. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. She blinked, disoriented, meeting Strand's leering gaze. "There's definitely some real electricity between us," he said with a dark chuckle. That was it. Peter snapped. With a fierce cry, he shot a web at Mary Jane, yanking her away from Strand's grasp in one swift motion. Before Strand could react, Peter unleashed his full strength, driving his fists into Sandman, shattering his rocky form into a storm of sandy debris that rained down around the room. Strand's hand crackled with energy, and before Peter could react, he unleashed a bolt of lightning. Peter dove out of the way just in time, the bolt slamming into the wall, setting it ablaze. Without hesitation, Peter scooped Mary Jane into his arms, his mind racing as he dashed for the window. With a powerful leap, Peter burst through the glass, high above the city. The wind roared in his ears as they plummeted through the night sky. Mary Jane's scream was swallowed by the wind as Peter fired a web, swinging them both safely through the towering buildings. Back inside, Sandman's scattered pieces began to melt and swirl together, reforming quickly into his human shape. Furious, Strand ran to the window, glaring into the night. There was no sign of Spider-Man below. But looking up, he caught a glimpse of the figure leaping across the sky, Mary Jane in his arms, moving from one tower to the next. With a snarl, Strand raised his hand and fired another bolt of lightning. The crackling energy lit up the night as it seared through the air, shattering windows in a brilliant explosion of glass. On the roof of the tower, Spider-Man landed safely, setting Mary Jane down at the stairwell door. He quickly tore the door from its hinges, pulling it open. "Run!" he urged her, his voice firm. "Get out of here!" Mary Jane hesitated for just a moment, her eyes full of emotion. "I love you," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the chaos around them. Peter gave her a small, quick smile beneath his mask. "Cool," he said, trying to hide the weight of the moment. As Mary Jane disappeared down the stairs, Peter turned back to face the danger. Across the gap, on the rooftop of the South Tower, Sandman and Strand emerged from the stairwell. Without warning, Strand unleashed a barrage of lightning bolts across the divide, sending chunks of debris flying into the air. Peter barely dodged the incoming strikes, knowing better than to leap onto the nearby microwave tower. A perfect lightning rod. Strand, his eyes glowing with fury, raised his hands like a sorcerer summoning a storm. A swirling vortex of electromagnetic energy crackled into existence, fierce and glowing like a firestorm. The plasma surged toward the base of the microwave mast, heating the metal until it glowed red-hot. With a forceful motion, Strand bent the tower, twisting it toward him. The massive structure creaked and groaned under the strain before toppling forward, crashing across the gap between the two towers, creating a deadly bridge. Sandman wasted no time. He leaped onto the makeshift bridge, sprinting toward Spider-Man, his form hardening into solid rock once more. Peter braced himself. The battle was far from over. The final battle had begun. A clash of titans that raged across the rooftop, ferocious and elemental. Every moment was raw, intense, a true showdown between forces far beyond ordinary. Peter fought with all his might against Sandman, their blows shaking the rooftop as they pummeled each other mercilessly. Every object around them was reduced to rubble, crushed beneath their relentless assault. Peter's costume was shredded, torn half off as Sandman relentlessly battered him, his sandy form constantly reforming after each hit. Meanwhile, Strand was working his own brand of chaos. He ripped open the power panel near the giant rooftop fans, pulling out the thick 440-volt cables. His body absorbed the electric energy as he screamed into the sky, feeding off the power with a terrifying force. The lower half of Manhattan dimmed in a sudden brownout as Strand's power grew, surrounding him with a swirling blue-white force field. The electromagnetic energy was so strong it lifted objects into the air and even melted the steel railing near him. Peter, barely conscious from Sandman's assault, was thrown off the roof. But just as always, he clung to life, catching himself on a web and swinging back up, refusing to give in. Sandman loomed above him, but Peter was quick. He fired a web, lassoing Sandman just as Strand unleashed another massive lightning bolt. Peter dropped over the edge of the roof, pulling the web taut, and dragged Sandman directly into the path of the blinding lightning. The bolt wrapped around Sandman, fusing his body into a molten mass of glass. Strand, furious, cursed, and ran across the makeshift bridge of the collapsed microwave tower, heading for the north side. Behind him, Sandman's once formidable body cooled into a smoking lump of glass, frozen in a position of agony, like a sculpture of pain. On the north tower, Spider-Man appeared from the shadows, dragging a fire hose. Just as Strand prepared to summon more power, Peter unleashed a blast of water. The water hit Strand's electrical surge, creating a massive steam explosion that sent both of them flying. Peter hit the ground hard, but Strand wasn't done. He staggered forward, bleeding and weakened, but still advancing. Strand summoned the last of his energy, veins bulging with the effort. He prepared for a final, lethal blast. The power coursed through him, crackling in the air. Peter, still reeling, raised his head, and their eyes locked. Strand fired, but Peter moved faster. In one fluid motion, he fired a web at Strand, looping it around him, and leaped over the edge of the tower, pulling Strand with him. Together, they plummeted down the side of the building, Strand screaming as bolts of electricity exploded from him in every direction, lighting up the night sky like a fantastical display of energy. Peter fought to stay conscious as they fell, firing webs at the building in a desperate attempt to slow their descent. One web finally caught hold of the far tower, yanking Peter toward it. He slammed into the side of the building, coming to a sudden stop as his webbing held firm. But Strand wasn't so lucky. The force of the fall sent him rocketing past Peter, slamming into the steel columns with a sickening crunch. The lightning stopped. The only sound left was the faint hum of power fading away, and the distant wail of sirens from the streets far below. Strand's broken body dangled at the end of Peter's web, lifeless. Exhausted, Peter climbed back up to the observation floor, the very window he had shattered while saving Mary Jane. Moving slowly, he pulled Strand's limp form up behind him, dragging him into the building. He laid him out on the floor, his own body aching and his costume in tatters. Strand was dying, his body broken and bleeding from the battle. Peter, breathing heavily, ripped off what remained of his mask, revealing his face to Strand for the first time. Strand coughed weakly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What's your name, kid?" "Peter," he replied, his voice quiet. "Peter Parker." Strand chuckled, though the sound was weak and filled with pain. "Peter Parker? What are you, a senior in high school?" Peter nodded. "Yeah, I graduate next week." Strand's smile faltered, and he coughed up blood. His eyes met Peter's one last time. "Unbelievable," he muttered before his head slumped to the side, and he was gone. Peter stood in the aftermath of the battle, his body aching and his mind racing. The chaos had finally settled, leaving only silence and destruction in its wake. He slumped, exhausted, breathing heavily as he took in the scene around him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the pallet. Stacks upon stacks of neatly bundled bills, $250 million, stolen in the most meticulous way imaginable. A half-cent here, a fraction there, from countless accounts all over the world. It was impossible to return, beyond anyone's reach to make right. He stared at the money for a moment, then shrugged. What now? As Peter turned away, something strange happened. A brisk breeze began to stir around the rooftop, tugging at the loose bills on the pallet. One by one, they caught in the wind and fluttered into the air. Soon, a cascade of $100 bills spiraled upward, rising like a green cloud over the city, spreading out over the skyline. At first, no one in the streets below noticed. The people of New York were too busy with their own lives to look up at the strange phenomenon in the sky. But then, the cloud began to drift down. Bills fluttered through the air, carried on the summer breeze, raining down on the city like confetti. From Central Park to the Battery, the streets were soon filled with a flurry of green, swirling through the evening light. It wasn't long before New Yorkers noticed. Slowly at first, people paused in confusion, snatching bills out of the air, staring at them in disbelief. But as the hundreds continued to rain down, the streets came alive with energy. Laughter, cheers, and shouts filled the air as people scrambled to collect the falling money. Strangers danced in the streets, hands raised to the sky, catching bills as if they were raindrops. It was the first night of summer, warm and clear, and the city had never seen anything like it. As far as the eye could see, it was raining $100 bills, a wild celebration stretching for miles. And for just that moment, the entire city was united in wonder. Epilogue. Guess They Weren't Wrong, by Peter Parker.
Hanging from my perch atop the radio tower, I glanced out over the city. It had become my favorite spot since they rebuilt it. A place where I could clear my head. The world below bustled on, unaware of my watchful eyes. The money? That was a cute trick, I suppose. Letting all that cash float down over the city like a summer breeze. Did it change the world? Not really. It didn't save anyone, except maybe me. School was wrapping up, but I wasn't exactly gliding through final days. Bruised and battered, I told my classmates I'd fallen off my moped. Again. They all rolled their eyes, probably thinking I was a bit of a klutz. Guess they weren't wrong. Then there was MJ. She'd come back too, though she was different now. Quieter, more distant. She didn't hang with her old friends anymore, so they didn't quite know what to make of her, but she didn't care. Maybe neither did I. The last days of school brought closure in their own way. MJ and I received our grade in that science project we'd worked on together. A solid A+. It should have been a big deal. She'd even graduate with a B average and get that car she'd been talking about. But none of that seemed to matter to her anymore. She had other plans now, bigger plans. Med school. New direction. As we stood there, she turned to me, her voice soft. "Thanks, Peter, helping me see the wonder in things." Then she kissed me. For a moment, everything fell away. Something about that kiss, it felt so familiar. I found myself smiling, no longer the awkward geek I used to be, but someone different, someone confident. "Mary Jane," I whispered, leaning in close. "Close your eyes." She looked at me, confused, but did as I asked. I leaned closer, dropping my voice lower like Spidey. "Do you still trust me?" Her eyes flew open in shock. Realization drawing, she stared at me, wide-eyed but then not, squeezing her eyes shut again. I kissed her, this time deeper, and she reached up, her fingers tangling my hair. Across the courtyard, I noticed two of her old friends gawking at us, stunned. But MJ didn't care. Neither did I. She pulled back, her eyes filled with wonder. "My God, Peter. Are you really him? I mean..." I smiled and hushed her gently. "Shh." In that moment, it felt like everything was falling into place. It's what everyone hopes for, right? That one day someone will see the real you, past the mask you wear, and appreciate what's hidden inside. MJ saw me, the real me. Just as we leaned in for another kiss, a hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. Flash, of course. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. MJ was someone like me. He tried to get tough, told me to take a walk with him. I shrugged. Sure, why not? Before I turned to leave, I smirked at MJ. The two male wolf spiders, Pardosa, encounter each other in the presence of a female. They assume ritual threat postures. MJ's eyes sparkled with amusement. Poor Flash didn't stand a chance. He dragged me around the corner ready to fight. He swung without warning, a wild punch, but I ducked easily, and his fist smashed into the wall instead. "Careful, Flash," I said, smiling. "You could sprain something." Clutching his hand in pain, he tried to charge again, but I sidestepped him easily. With a quick flick of my wrist, I shot a tiny web out into a nearby railing. Flash rushed at me, tripped over the web, and tumbled into the wall. "Really, Flash?" I said, shaking my head. "Watch your step." I helped him up, casually attaching a web on the back of his jacket, tethering him to the railing without him noticing, and I walked away. He roared and lunged after me, but the web yanked him back like a dog on a leash. He went flying, landing flat on his back with a loud thud. The kids who had been watching erupted in laughter. I raised my hands, grinning. I never touched him, I swear. Later that evening, back in my suit and perched on the radio tower again, I thought about everything. Mary Jane and I were going to different colleges. Figures, right? But we still saw each other every weekend. Her grades were better than mine, but I chalked that up to the long hours. It's not easy being your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. It takes it out of you. With a deep breath, I pushed off from the tower, my web catching the night air as I swung over the city. The lights of New York twinkled below, and for now, all felt right. Be good, I whispered to no one in particular. Then I was gone. Just a black dot against the sea of lights. A tiny spider heading home.